internet, and welcome, finally, after nearly 2 years, to my video about the Siege of Vienna in 1693 and the Battle of the Kahlenberg. Yes, I know I said would be postponed, indefinitely, but I am finally in the situation where I have both some decent camera equipment, some decent sound equipment, and an editing slave, which you can't see because he's chained to my editing computer, ready to do the work for me. So instead of the shorter little 13-minute video I had planned for you, which you will get, don't worry, I'm now capable of making videos a bit more often than I have been this year, but instead, finally, we're going to do the Battle of Vienna. The video, or the basically the video I started my channel for, to be completely honest. This is where Western civilization was determined. This was where the Ottoman Empire's otherwise inexorably advance into Central Europe was stopped, and Western Europe was allowed to expand in its own fashion without any real threats from the outside, allowing it to become the dominant culture across the world. This was the Battle of Vienna, and I truly hope you enjoy it. In 1683, the Ottoman Empire was at its height. It stretched across the northern coast of Africa, covered all of the Middle East, had control of Egypt a good way down the Nile, and had spread into Eastern Europe throughout the occupied Balkan areas. Ever since its complete victory over the Byzantine Empire, which finally ended with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the expansion of the Ottoman Empire had been slow but constant and, well, almost unstoppable. A few setbacks had been occurring here and there, like the Siege of Vienna in 1529, which was mostly ended due to illness, and of course the famous naval battle at Lepanto later the same century. But again, these were basically, it seemed, minor setbacks. The Austro-Ottoman Wars, or the Holy Roman Empire versus the Ottoman Wars, had at this point on and off been going on for nearly 300 years, and the Ottomans were in a clear leading position. Following the Italian Wars, about 250 years prior, they had been allied with France. And of course, at this point, the most powerful ruler in Europe was Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. And he was in nearly, constant warfare with the Holy Roman Empire, who was his biggest rival, to see who could become dominant in Europe. Spain, of course, having fallen into a complete, shall we say, funk following its massive superiority in the early 16th century. This French-Ottoman alliance had allowed the two powers to squeeze the Holy Roman Empire between it. The Holy Roman Empire had its own allies, mainly the Republic of Venice and the United Provinces, now free from the Spanish yoke following the Peace of Utrecht and, the Greater Peace of Westphalia during the 30th Years' War, but also the Polis-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, all of these allies were allies of convenience, shall we say, and with France on a powerful upswing and the Ottomans as strong as ever, things were, again, looking somewhat bad for the Holy Roman Empire, who was slowly being squeezed out of territories in the areas of the United Provinces of Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, that area, in the areas in France beyond the Rhine that they had, modern-day France, beyond the Rhine that they had otherwise been in charge of, and of course by the inexorably advance of the Ottomans into now Eastern Europe and Hungary. Hungary having once been the complete dominion of the Holy Roman Empire, but was today in fact only, almost completely an Ottoman outpost, if you want to call it that, or an Ottoman colony, with the Holy Roman Empire only controlling perhaps about a third of its original area, and even that third was threatened by the rebellion of a local noble by the name of Imre the, I think. I apologize to anyone with a passable knowledge of the Hungarian language for how I'm going to be butchering every single Hungarian name in this particular video. And so with this in mind, in 1683, the Holy Roman Empire under Emperor Leopold was in a sticky situation. It had recently lost several wars to France again on the Rhine frontier, and has lost much territory. And in the early summer of that year, Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, gathered 170,000 men, probably with extra support from the Crimean Tatars. Theoretically, those Tatars are to be counted as part of the 170,000 men that the Ottoman roll of battle indicates that Kara Mustafa started the wars with, but again, these were mainly hordes of irregular cavalrymen, so it's really, really difficult to say with absolute certainty. Anyway, 170,000 men advanced towards Vienna. It has later been stated by certain Turkish historians, and of course Western historians, that Kara Mustafa didn't actually as much wanted to take the city, but simply wanted to force a war with a battle that would go against the Holy Roman Empire to secure some new trade treaties and perhaps an extra bit of Hungary. However, you don't gather nearly 200,000 men and strike directly at your biggest enemy's capital city unless you at least have some idea that you might exploit the situation further than simply wanting a few trade concessions. Especially since you are, of course, also fighting to extend your rule over the earth, as the Ottoman sultans absolutely did. Anyway, against this rather massive horde, the empire could put up, well, not a lot of people, basically. Their standing army in Hungary was somewhere between 10 and 20,000 strong, and there was no way its commander was going to risk it in direct battle with the Turkish hordes. Instead, he dispersed several troops into various garrison positions and retreated with the rest of the army towards Vienna. The Turks took a few of those garrisons, barricaded some of the others, left more to the rebels under Imre the that we have already talked about, and continued the march towards Vienna, where they arrived in early June, just after the emperor and his entire court had left the city, fled down the Rhine, and basically left the city in command of old Count von Starhemberg, who was supposed to be leading the garrison in the expected upcoming siege. Starhemberg had been left with 11,000 imperial troops plus 5,000 volunteers from Vienna's population itself to hold the city, along with about 350 cannons and fairly strong, recently modernized bastions for its defense. Leopold, the emperor, as I said, had fled down the Rhine to Passau with his entire court and about 60,000 people from the population of Vienna and the surrounding areas, as many fled to avoid the roaming horsemen of the Crimean Khanate, who were pillaging, plundering, burning, raping, murdering, all the stuff that irregular horsemen are so apt to do in the advance towards Vienna. Charles of Lorraine, who commanded the empire's forces in Hungary, or had commanded the empire's forces in Hungary, and who had been the generalissimo of the Holy Roman Empire for a few years at this point, retreated with his 20,000 strong imperial force towards the Austrian city of Linz. I want to mention a little bit about Charles de Lorraine here, and this is just an aside, and I know Charles de Lorraine had, well, basically been Duke of Lorraine, or Lothringen, or whatever you want to call it. But in the War of Reunions a decade earlier, Louis XIV of France had basically conquered that particular bit of territory and sat on it and would not allow Charles to come back, as he could have led a rebellion or something. At which point, of course, Charles had his loyalty towards the Holy Roman Empire strengthened and completely, cemented, which basically let him take command of the Empire's forces. This was one of those things that would eventually come back to bedevil the Ottoman-French alliance, and if I ever one day do a video about tactically clever but strategically really boneheaded decisions made by otherwise competent rulers, Louis' treatment of Charles de Lorraine will absolutely be on that list, but that's of course a video for another time. While the siege were beginning in early June, Emperor Leopold of course tried his utmost to gather up as many allies as he possibly could. At this point, of course, he had the problem that the empire was at the time a hodgepodge of local rulers, basically only in name united under the overall sort of authority of the emperor. The sovereign rulers and the various princes of the empire, especially the various elector princes, were not guaranteed to just come running because the emperor had some issues in his own core domains. And of course, from France, he could expect absolutely no help whatsoever. In fact, Louis immediately used the opportunity to send forces to the Rhine border to look for any possibilities of, taking advantage of the situation and perhaps grabbing a good bit of Rhineland area, while the emperor was kind of forced to look the other way. So, as you can imagine, it didn't look good for the empire. On the surface, because there was actually a couple of things that it looked like the Turks and the France had slightly overlooked when they expected a quick and dirty end to these particular wars. First of all, you don't just get 170,000 men together and tell them to march off. You especially don't do this in the days before radio and, paved metal roads and cars and stuff. No. It had taken basically 15 months to get the Ottoman army together, and of course there is at the same time no way that could be hid for the emperor. So he had basically spent 15 months trying to gather as many allies as possible, and in this he had one major advantage because he had one major ally: the Pope. The Pope had absolutely no interest whatsoever in seeing Islam get a hold of Vienna. Vienna was at the time simply the most important trade and road center in Central Europe. And if the Ottoman Empire were to get in touch with that, well, there was absolutely no way they could be stopped from spreading into central Germany or down into Italy without a monumental exertion of capital and resources that probably might not even be available to the Christian powers at the time if France could not be, persuaded to join, and there was absolutely no evidence of that. So the Pope, through his papal envoy, basically spent a lot of the year that the Austrians had been given in preparation for helping put together alliances. He extended various olive branch to the North German Protestant electoral princes to let them or get them into a position where they would help the emperor despite any sort of religious and political disagreements there might be there. He allowed Leopold to extend some very, 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 very generous promises of money and favors to the newly elected King of Poland, Jan Sobieski, if he would stick to an alliance and come and help them. And overall, he allowed, the Italian rulers to join the alliance without any particular fear of, surrendering their very, very hard-won independence to a future imperial offense going down south. So the empire was not quite as bad off as it could have been. However, they were still the small, irrelevant matter of 170,000 Turks in the outskirts of Vienna. How long could 16,000 troops hold the city? Because it would take probably at least 2 or 3 months to get any kind of relief army together, and of course at the time any siege worth its salt would probably be over quite a bit before that time. So basically the fate of the Christian world at the time rested on the shoulders of Count Sternberg and his 16,000 strong garrison in the city of Vienna itself. Okay, before we go on here, we need to talk about just how important this battle actually is, because I want anyone watching this video to be aware of this is not just any war throughout the years, just how important this thing is. If the Imperial Relief Forces and the Holy League is not capable of winning this battle, the Turks will take Vienna and basically crush the heart out of the center of the Holy Roman Empire. With the political differences surrounding the, Protestant Catholic split in the empire, there is every reason to believe that the empire will slowly begin to collapse at this point. The empire, Leopold will probably, in the beginning, establish a new capital, and status quo will go on, or a new status quo will be developed, but eventually the internal schisms in the Holy Roman Empire, with its weakening, with the Turks in control of central Austria, all of the Pannonian plains, be able to strike up into Poland, be able to strike up into Germany, into the Swiss Confederacy, down into Italy, would probably, and of course the French, taking advantage of the situation to strike further in their particular situation, would in all probability create a Europe totally divided between the two superpowers of the Kingdom of France, the Ottoman Empire, with a no man's battle zone around the Rhine in the between lands, which would of course eventually develop into a full-scale warfare between those two pre-modern superpowers for each other. Had this happened, whatever the outcome, the world would obviously be completely different. There are many battles out there where you say, oh, this changed the world, and some of them did, but some of them probably wouldn't have mattered too much overall. I mean, basically the English had conquered France after Agincourt, but other factors played in. This, however, is far more important than this. The fact that history turned out the way it did, with the weakening of, or later weakening of the Ottoman Empire, basically meant that Europe would no longer have an external threat to its culture. While there would of course be unending warfare from there, still the sort of general Western culture would remain supreme and allow for, Europe, Western Europe at least, to Western and Central Europe to become as dominant culturally, politically, economically on the world stage as it become. That was the legacy of the battle that is to come. So on the 12th of September 1683, it came down to the one battle. All the squabblings about money was over, all the political intrigues were basically finished. This was where the future and fate of Europe was going to be decided once and for all. The Allies had about 90,000 men under the combined leadership of the Polish king Jan Sobieski and, of course, the Imperial Generalissimo Charles of Lorraine. And the two had quickly established a very functional working relationship, including with the other forces from the Holy Roman Empire who would be fighting under Lorraine directly in the battle, while the king would lead his own forces, and the entire battle remaining under the king's overall control. On the other hand, as I have mentioned before, the Turks were somewhat handicapped by the fact that Kara Mustafa was not exactly a very good general, no matter how effective he might have been as a Grand Vizier. He had basically run the siege fairly sluggardly, to be perfectly honest. Methodically and effectively. Had he had unlimited time, there's absolutely no doubt the city would have fallen without too much hassle, but with the relief army coming, he made even then no real attempts to speed up or storm the city, even despite costs, and then faced the relief army with a fait accompli of a conquered city and in control of its remaining defenses. He also did not had his forces contest the relief army's crossing of the Danube, and in fact basically allowed them to march up, as I said, to the Kahlenberg and the heights of Rasten, overlooking the city of Vienna and both the Ottoman siege work and their main army camp. However, none of this necessarily needed to matter. He still had at this time about 150,000 troops, plus his hordes of irregular horsemen, though there is quite a bit of discussion how much the Crimeans actually participated in the ensuing battle. More than enough to make one last attempt to storm the Lion Bastion, blow it up, and send his forces into the city that would eventually fall, and hold off the relief army now charging down from the heights above his army's positions. The battle began in the early hours of the morning, where the Ottomans attempted to attack the relief forces of, well, I will from now on call them the Holy League army, since that was basically what they were terming themselves at the time, and the Holy League would of course remain a thing for the rest of the Turkish armies up until its final end in 1701. But anyway, the Ottomans attempted to attack the Holy League armies before they could get in position to advance, but was counterattacked by the German Landknechts under Charles de Lorraine and thrown back in some confusion. Charles then led his forces forward and gained good ground on the left of the Holy League part of the battlefield, pushing back the Turks, who were also handicapped, of course, by having part of their army attempting to attack, part of it manning defensive positions, and part of it trying to take the city. In the early parts of the afternoon, however, Charles's attack was somewhat stalled, and the battle grind to a couple of hours of repeated charges by each side without anyone managing to get the upper hand. Around this time, however, the Polish infantry were attacking on the Holy League right and the, of course, Turkish left. They gained also ground enough to take the village of Gersthof, at which point that particular battle ground down to a hold. The Turks had been on that particular side of the field handicapped by the fact that they were covering literally right there for the final ditch attack on the city, but at this point they had managed to form a fairly strong defensive line that they felt could hold back the Poles before the Polish infantry could push further on. Towards late afternoon, somewhere between 4 and 6 p.m., and the battle had been raging for more than 12 hours. At this point, more cautious Holy League commanders could well have lost the battle, the war, and the entire future of Europe by retreating their armies in what seemed to have become a stalemate and resting them perhaps to prepare for another situation, risking, of course, to lose the city in the process. However, seemingly without communication, Charles and Jan Sobieski both trusted each other enough that they knew the other one would not retreat without them, so they decided to make one final push. They could see that several Ottoman forces were abandoning the field and were thinking that the Ottoman morale was much lower than the current stalemate would indicate. So, reorganizing his forces, Charles pushed his armies ahead and started pushing the Turks savagely back on his side towards their main encampment, where they were to make yet another stand. This, of course, could have been a rather terrible situation if he had been extended too far from the Poles, as of course the Crimeans could have circled around him and attacked him in the back. However, remember what I said about the battle on the Holy League left, where the Poles had been fighting, had developed into a sort of a standoff after Gersthof had been taken. Well, the Turks probably believed that they held, a strong defensive line here, and they probably did. What they didn't know was that the Polish infantry had never meant to do anything more than to push as far ahead as possible, take the line of villages surrounding Gersthof, and leave room for the hammer blow that Jan Sobieski was now planning. At 6 p.m., he himself, in the lead, with his youngest son by his side, led his cavalry forces out of a woodland area just below the Kahlenberg and moved up behind the shelter of the villages to begin the charge against the Turkish lines. 18,000 horsemen, the largest cavalry charge in history. For those of you who have watched the Lord of the Rings movie, take the charge of the Rohirrim at the third movie, triple that, and instead of basically light to medium cavalry in leather armor with swords, put them in heavily armed, heavily armored cavalry, the much fabled 4,000 winged hussars, followed by another 14,000 strong heavy to medium cavalry with long lances and incredibly heavy horses. The Turks literally didn't know what hit them, advancing at a slow pace up until they could do the gallop into the Turkish forces. The king had divided his army into 3 lines, with his 4,000 heavy winged hussars in the front, led by the various other stuff, and he smashed into the Turkish forces in, well, again, as I said, imagine the Lord of the Rings thing. Remove all the supernatural things like with ancient war elephants, and of course Turks are not orcs, but basically have the same kind of somewhat, shall we say, somewhat lightly armed infantry forces in a great big grouping, and then 18,000 heavy cavalry troopers smashing into them, lances lowered. Boom! The Turks were completely overthrown, desperately retreating towards their camps as the Polish infantry now ran forward to complete the rout. On the Turkish right, the collapse of their left meant that they would have to escape unless they wanted to be rolled up by the flank by the continued attack of Sobieski and the pressure from Charles's infantry to the front. At this point, Starhemberg led his remaining just about 5,000 troops in a sortie from the town, and the Turkish defenses collapsed. A few forces retreated to their camp, trying to defend it there. The rest went into a headlong escape down the Danube towards the, well, somewhat questionable safety of the Hungarian heartlands on the high plain there, and moving towards the mountain refuges of Serbia. And with that ended the Battle of Vienna that decided the future of Europe. Leopold returned to his capital with all the people who had fled earlier. Jan Sobieski and the other Christian war leaders, swore eternal gratitude and brotherhood to each other. Sobieski returned home with his enormous part of the loot, actually creating somewhat of, bad feelings towards some of the other Christian armies, particularly the Saxon contingent, who came late to the plundering and in fact got so little that they got insulted and just marched straight home. This would, of course, in the end have surprisingly negative effects on the Holy Roman Empire within the next 120 years, but as for now, everything was just triumph and success. Imros the Curly, the rebel leader I mentioned earlier, fled his principality his rebel principality in Hungary for the empire's successful armies, and of course for the vengeance of Jan Sobieski before he could do unto him the things he had promised to do if he didn't, stuck his pipe in before Jan left for Kahlenberg, and in fact ended his days after fighting in more Turkish defeats as a rather obscure Turkish local nobleman in northern Anatolia. The war itself, of course, did not end with the battle. In fact, it continued up until 1701 with continuous Turkish defeats. Charles of Lorraine led the first push into Hungary that regained much of the Pannonian Plain for the Holy Roman Empire. His later successor as Generalissimo of the imperial forces, Eugene of Savoy, would eventually fight the Battle of Senta and eventually sign the Treaty of Karlovitz that I have made a video about earlier, and eventually the Treaty of Passarowitz, which basically ended the wars with a complete Holy Roman victory that had pushed its borders out to, well, greater than they had been for almost 2 centuries. On the Turkish side, Kara Mustafa, with the remnants of his army, eventually limped into the fortress at Belgrade and was there on Christmas Day 1683, strangled in the traditional fashion by a silk rope drawn by 3 strong men on either side, on the orders of the leader of his Janissaries, after a command by the Sultan had reached them that this could not have been handled. The war itself forced the Ottoman Empire into the decline that eventually became terminal and led to its dissolution 240 some years later after the First World War. In the West, the battle immediately didn't mean too much because literally all of the imperial forces were in the next good amount of years after that forced to be on the Balkan fronts to exploit the gains made against the Turks. So the French themselves were not sort of immediately weakened by this battle, but the sort of integration of the Pannonian highlands with its tax and people bases allowed the empire, and of course the unity formed now by the emperor with his northern princes, allowed a imperial unity that gave the French so severe problems later in the 9-Year War, and of course the War of Spanish Succession allowed allowing the Protestant forces of Northern Europe and the Empire to hold back the French expansion into the primary power of its age without compare that Louis had otherwise been aiming at since the earliest days of his kingship in the 1660s, where he personally took power. And with that, I want to end this video. There will probably be a full video at one point about the Turkish wars as such. As I mentioned slightly earlier, I might eventually do a video about, shall we call it, boneheaded strategic decisions made in otherwise brilliant tactical situations by otherwise intelligent rulers and so on. But this was the Battle of Vienna, the turning point of the development of the Ottoman empires and its encroachments upon Europe, and basically setting the course for Western civilization's spread as we know it today, without any real meaningful threats from the outside. So yeah, the Battle of Vienna. I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, that was it. The Battle of Vienna. My magnificent octopus, magnum opus, I'm sorry. Again, this might not be, in your opinion, my gentle viewers, the best video I've ever done, but it is the one I have been wanting to do from day one. Literally everything I've done so far has been to practice for this one, so I truly do hope you enjoyed it. It was, of course, as you will have seen, of immense importance both to the development of Europe as such, to the development of the Ottoman Empire, to the French kingdom, etc., etc., etc. And again, there is plenty written about it, there are plenty of other stuff about it. For one reason or another, there isn't actually that many movies made about it, but there is a couple of really good Polish ones, if nothing else, because, of course, Jan Sobieski is the Polish national hero. A couple of Austrian ones as well, but as a general rule, and I still don't know why, we haven't really seen like a really effective English language version of a movie regarding the Battle of Vienna, and I still don't know how, because, well, it is what it is. But anyway, I will be back very shortly with the shorter versions of the videos I promised you, but as for now, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.